Hi guys, I'm going to show you how to make these cookies today because they are so big, so delicious, and just so soft. For reference, those are jumbo marshmallows. That's how big these cookies are. So this is the first recipe that I ever started making from scratch, and it's the first one I ever customized, so it's very near and dear to my heart. Step one is you got to decide that you're ready to start baking. And by doing that, you got to prepare yourself. So go ahead and pull back your hair, throw on an apron, and wash your hands. Then you want to make sure you have all of your ingredients. So for minimum, you need 2.5 cups of flour, 2 sticks of butter or 1 cup of butter, 1 cup of packed brown sugar, half a cup of white granulated sugar, I think that's how it's pronounced, 2 large eggs, and 1 teaspoon of vanilla along with half a teaspoon of salt. I promise that's just our salt shaker. I'm sorry if that's not school appropriate. 2 cups of your toppings of choice and 1 teaspoon of baking soda. So you're going to start off with your butter and both of your sugars. The 1 cup of brown sugar should be packed, which is why it's so stiff, and the 1/2 cup of white sugar should just be as it is. The easiest way to do that is to have your butter pre-cut into little squares like I usually do. Your butter should be softened and it should be unsalted. So this means you should buy your butter with the label that says unsalted or baking butter because you're going to be adding salt in later on. And then to soften it, you just want to leave it out of the fridge for about a half hour before you start making your cookies. Or in this case, preparing them because we don't cook them until the next day. But yeah, then I use the butter knife to cut the butter so that way it's easier to mix and that way it's easier to reach room temperature. And I also use it throughout the video to clean my whisker thingy and to kind of stir later on. The easiest way to combine these to save yourself some hassle is to just squish in the sugar with the butter, and then you want to make sure you scrape so that way you don't have sugar pockets on the side of the bowl, and you're just going to kind of squish, scrape, and that's just how you mix this sort of ingredients until it reaches a more even texture and consistency. Then you know you're ready to move on to the next step. So you shouldn't have to clean off your scraper too many times, or your whisker too many times, but you might have to. So once it reaches about that consistency, keep in mind I'm a little bit short on butter. You can move on to the next step, which is adding in your 2.5 cups of flour. It should be all-purpose white flour. Then you're going to add in half a teaspoon of salt and 1 teaspoon of baking soda. Make sure this is not baking powder, it's baking soda. Then you're going to mix that in with a separate whisker, that way it's nice and dry and it doesn't stick to it. And you want that to be nice and dispersed evenly so you don't get a random pocket of salt later on. Then you're going to add in your 2 large eggs. Again, the easiest way to mix this is to kind of squish the yolks so they don't try and scramble and run away from you. Get it? Scramble. Anyways, and then you're going to mix in that with your wet ingredients. I use 2 bowls because that's just the easiest way, but you're going to have a wet bowl and a dry bowl until you mix it all into the same bowl. So this is your wet bowl, and that's where you mix in your butter and eggs and all that sort of thing. So it should reach a nice thinner consistency than before, but make sure you clean off your whisker and your knife. That way you don't have any surprise chunks of butter and sugar later on. Once it reaches a nice consistency like this, how pretty, then you can start adding in your vanilla. The vanilla won't take too much stirring, but it should just be 1 teaspoon of vanilla. And you mix that in nice and evenly. And it's just because it's a little bit, you want to mix it before you add in your dry stuff so that way it gets mixed in evenly. Then you can start adding in your dry bowl. You're supposed to do this a little bit at a time. And the easiest way to do that is to pour it in and then get it wet. The more wet you get it, the more it will mix evenly, if that makes sense. I'll show you right here when I pour all of it in because I'm impatient, that you have to stir a lot slower and get it wet first before you can actually mix it, because it's less likely to revolt against you that way and get powder all over you and your counter. But if so, that's why you're wearing your apron. Safety first. So then you're going to continue to mix. This is going to take some concentration, so throw on a podcast, listen to some music, or think about someone you really don't like, maybe rant to someone, because it's going to take a little bit of arm power and a little bit of time. But you're going to mix it all together until you reach a nice even consistency. This consistency, however, is going to be much thicker than your previous consistency, so keep that in mind. It's going to take more arm power. Unless you're fancy, you can throw it in one of those bowls that stirs it for you, but I'm not fancy and I can use the workout, so I just do it like this. Again, continue to get everything out of your little whisker. This is when it's handy to use one of these little rubber plasticky kind. That way you don't bend your metal ones out of shape, because this is such a thick texture that it's just going to get bent out of shape. So once it reaches about that consistency, you can add in your toppings. I do chocolate chips because I'm basic and I love chocolate chips. I do 2 cups scampi, which means not all the way full, because it's a lot of chocolate chips and I don't want them to go to waste because they don't stick in the batter. That's how much chocolate chips it calls for. But you can use less if you don't want diabetes early on like me. And then you're going to mix it. But since this texture is so thick and you're kind of just mixing in something that's not going to disperse itself really, it's not going to break down at all like the rest of the ingredients do, you might as well just use your knife. So go ahead and get all the batter off of your knife and get it off of your whisker. That way you're not wasting any of your batter. That's just no bueno. And then you can go ahead and use your butter knife to stir in your toppings, in this case chocolate chips. Don't forget to continue scraping along the sides so that way you can get all the batter mixed in evenly. Or else you're just going to have random chunks of chocolate chips and random chunks of batter, and that's just not as delectable. Again, I try and be a perfectionist and get all the batter off, but I make a lot of mistakes, so I'm not really a perfectionist, more of an ideal perfectionist. Speaking of not being a perfectionist or not being able to be a perfectionist, if you are able to, you're supposed to seal that onto the bowl, the plastic wrap. I'm not good at that and I can never get it to seal, so I end up pouring the batter into the plastic wrap itself. Perfectly fine. But this is what's going to make or break your recipe. The sealing of your cookie dough, you're going to seal it and then you're going to put it in the fridge. And the sealing of it and refrigeration is what's going to make it nice and big and fluffy and soft and just giant and delectable. This is what's going to make your recipe ideal and just perfect. So you're going to get all your batter up into that plastic and you're just going to wrap it up nice and good and tight. That way it's sealed. Again, I'm not good at this. I can't get it to do it on the bowl, and for some reason I can't get it to do it on itself. So I just squeeze it in the same way I used to try and squeeze into jeans that would give me muffin top, and then I add another layer. So you can't even tell. Ouch. But I add another layer of the saran wrap to kind of nice and wrap it up and try and seal it, but I kind of have trust issues, so I throw it in a Ziploc bag anyways. Doesn't matter, you're going to throw it in the fridge for about 24 hours. I didn't have that kind of time, so I threw it in for about 12 hours. It was a little more, but as long as it's in for 12 hours, you're good. And then the next day, you're going to preheat your oven to 400 degrees, and you're going to pull that baby out. Now it's time to cut it or scoop it or do whatever you want. If it's in a bowl, it makes more sense to scoop it, but if you just threw it in like this, kind of in like a brick clay thing, then it makes more sense to cut it. Now, if you're good at math, you would know that we have 40 kids in our class, and I'm making 2 ingredient sets, or 2 batches, ingredients-wise, of my cookie dough. So I can just make 20 cookies per batch, and that should feed everybody. But for some reason, I can't count, and so I thought I would do 5 columns and 4 rows, and I end up doing 5 columns and 3 rows. So this leads to a little bit of inconsistency in the sizing later on. Not like I cut it that evenly anyways, but I thought I was doing a good job, and that's all that matters, is that you feel good about yourself and these taste delicious, which they're going to taste delicious either way. So now you're going to line your cookie sheet with parchment paper. It's what you're supposed to use, but if you want to use wax paper, go ahead. Speaking from personal experience, wax paper will do the job just fine. Only thing is, it's going to fill up your house with smoke, and it's going to smell really, really bad. Like, really bad. But it'll do the job just fine if you don't have parchment paper. Then you're going to take your cookie clumps, chunks, scoops, whatever you did, and you're going to put that on your parchment paper. You can shape it to be whatever shape you want. If you're fancy, you can even use cookie cutters. I kind of just shape it into a semi-cookie-ish shape, and then I kind of just leave it like that because I like it when it's nice and abstract and unique, and then I can call dibs on a specific cookie, and I know which cookie I call dibs on, you know? So then you're going to just shape them up and throw them on your parchment paper. Now, keep in mind, if you have more cookies, you're going to need more space between them. If they're bigger cookies, they need more space. If they're smaller, they need less space. Or if they're smaller, yeah, they need less space, but they also need less time, which is something to keep in mind because I always forget that. Safety first, throw it in the oven. And for the recipe that I am showing you, you're going to put it in for 20 minutes. I always put it for 17 just to check and make sure I don't burn them because I'm really scared of that. But These cookies I use less time because they are smaller. The ones that I'm showing you will make giant cookies, but ideally it'll make between 12 and 24 cookies, but they will be gigantic. This I'm trying to make 40 cookies, so they're going to be smaller, especially since I miscounted and miscalculated and I'm short on butter. So there's going to be smaller cookies for this batch. I'm so sorry, but you throw the rest into the fridge. Okay, y'all, the last step in this process is to find someone to sample your cooking. I usually end up having to bully my dad, but he was pretty willing this time, so yay me.
Great job.